EVO.
Pie in the Sky Media. This series contains adult language and descriptions of graphic violence throughout. Listener discretion is advised.
Lizzie Borden took an axe, gave her mother 40 whacks. When she saw what she had done, gave her father 41.
On the morning of August 4th, 1892, the prosperous mill town of Fall River, Massachusetts was the site of a grisly double murder. Andrew Borden, a prominent local businessman, and his second wife Abby were found hacked to death in their home near the city center. It seemed to be the work of a madman.
Welcome back to Criminal Mischief with Carolyn and Brandon. You're listening to episode 170, The Unknowable Lizzie Borden. What actually drew you to this story out of all the stories that you could have told?
Well, I think we all like an unsolved mystery. And there's something sort of peculiarly ordinary and horrifying about the story of Lizzie Borden. You know, that this is someone who seemed to the outside world to be a pretty typical middle-class woman in a little mill town in Fall River, and yet she's accused of this truly horrifying double murder of her father and her stepmother. And so from a point of view of psychology, that's fascinating. But also as someone who's really interested in trials and trials that become public sensation, I think that, you know, we can see a lot of what it was in the surrounding environment that made that story so dangerous, and why they struggled so much to make sense of it.
That's Cara Robertson, author of The Trial of Lizzie Borden.
Fall River, Massachusetts was a mill town, and this was America in the Gilded Age. So it was sort of at its height. It was known as the Manchester of America because of the number of textile mills. And the textile mills attracted a large number of immigrants too, mostly Irish, but also Portuguese. And the owners of the mills tended to be descendants of the Yankee settlers of that era. And there were a small number of families that controlled all of the mills in that area, of whom the Bordens were one.
The Bordens, Andrew and Abby, weren't like the other wealthy families in Fall River. It was complicated. You see, Andrew was born into a wealthy family, but in name only. His father's side was broke.
It's clear that Andrew Borden is one of the wealthiest men in town, and he's known that way. He doesn't have the same level of wealth as some of his Borden cousins, because he actually comes from a line that didn't have much money, and he made his own in real estate. So he also was a person of very simple tastes, and I think it suited him to live in a small house that was convenient to the places where he needed to collect his rents. I mean, he was highly regarded as a businessman, considered very astute, but it placed his daughters in a certain amount of social quarantine. I mean, if you can imagine what it's like for them, their status was a little more ambiguous, that they participated in many of the charitable pursuits that were typical of women of that class in that era. They volunteered at their church. Lizzie Borden was active in a number of other charities, including the Ladies Fruit and Flower League, the WCTU, the Temperance Organization. But she was obviously not in the highest social class, and it seemed like that was what she would have preferred.
Did Lizzie blame her father for that? For holding her and her older sister Emma back? In the late 1800s, their father Andrew had amassed roughly $10 million in today's money. It didn't bother Andrew Borden one bit that his social standing in high society was ambiguous in Fall River. But the same couldn't be said for his daughters.
It was a very odd combination of great wealth, great poverty, and also the two living very close together. You know, it was a town where you could kind of tell people's social status by the height that they lived above the river. The most recent immigrants, the poorest people lived like closest to the water, closest to the mills, and then There was a kind of flat area that was the business district, and then in the extremely hilly area above was where the elite lived. And so on the one hand, you're all kind of rubbing up together. On the other hand, there is this literalization of the stratification of the society. There were ways in which it might, that the fanciest houses might have looked like something in other bigger cities in America at that time. And there was regular ferry service to Boston and New York.
The Bordens lived in the flat area on 2nd Street. But Andrew's daughters, Lizzie and Emma, they yearned to live on the hill.
There were many ways in which the Borden household was very typical of its time, but there was something that was unusual. It was the site of essentially a Cold War between the younger Bordens, Lizzie and her sister Emma, and their parents, Andrew and Abby, who was the stepmother. About 5 years before the murders, there'd been a dispute about property. Essentially, Andrew Borden had decided to help out Abby's much younger half-sister by purchasing a house that she was living in and putting it in Abby's name. And while, I think most of us probably would not think much of that or think that that seemed odd, to the daughters, that seemed like a case of his taking money out of their hands and putting it into their stepmother's family. And it caused a lot of ill will. It may well have been the secrecy that did it. We don't really know. But all we know is that from that moment forward, they lived in this state of, Cold War. They certainly still spoke to each other, but they conducted their lives as separately as possible, taking meals separately when they could, not, socializing together. And, it was just generally known that it was a tense household for that reason.
The Bordens' home was an unhappy one. This feud had been going on for years. A simmering tension, as middle-class, unmarried so-called spinsters. In this Gilded Age, they came from wealth, and yet they lacked the independence to do and live as they wanted.
If you think about what her life was like versus someone at the true upper part of society who would have had a lot of social engagement and been out late at night, as well as organizing parties and things like that, and someone at the lower end, who would have been working in really extremely challenging conditions. She's sort of in the middle. It's another way in which she's very average.
And yet that could fester a lot of anger when you feel like you should be higher up and you're stuck in this middle spot. And that could cause a lot of frustration.
Yeah. I mean, one of her friends is quoted as saying that her father was a very simple person who liked simple things, and he just couldn't understand why his daughters might want more. And so for Lizzie Borden, who, apparently was pretty dissatisfied with her circumstances, you can imagine how, at age 32, she could be looking ahead and not seeing much ahead that seemed better than where she was. Clearly, if there was going to be a marriage that opportunity had pretty much passed by then. Both she and her sister were considered to be what was called then, spinsters. We do know one other odd fact, which is that shortly before the murders, Andrew bought the house back that he'd given them, thus giving them a pretty big cash infusion shortly before the murders. And whether or not that was significant, I leave it to your listeners.
So we don't know why he did that. There's no story as to he wanted to add it to his portfolio. He wanted to give them because he was only giving them, it sounds like the same wages as a mill worker, $4 a week for the young women to basically tool around with, right? Which is
right. So they had an allowance, on which to spend, in the old days, they would have called it pin money, to spend on their own, fripperies and entertainment. They didn't have to use it to run the household or anything like that. But it was, if you think about what the amount was, it was sort of roughly speaking what a mill worker would have earned. And, I think that gives you some sense of it feeling perhaps a little tight for people who wanted to conduct a life that was more socially elevated or luxurious.
And there was something else, something weird that happened in this household.
About a year before the murders, the Borden household was the site of very strange daylight burglary in which, some things of fairly minor value were stolen from what we call the master bedroom, the Andrew and Abby space. Some trinkets, some items of sentimental value, in particular to Abby Borden, some horse car tickets. Nothing that was of great value. But it was very strange because it was another case when Lizzie Borden, Bridget Sullivan, and in this case Emma were home. So it was hard to imagine how someone would have gotten in. And Lizzie Borden was known to have taken the police detective on a tour of the house and seemed, sort of agitated about it.
Andrew thought he could resolve the problem by not filing a police report. And he also began locking the room he shared with his wife, Abby. He made a big show of keeping the key in the living room.
Ultimately, her father called off the investigation and said, you're never going to solve this. And so many people have looked at that and said, this seems it seemed uncannily like the circumstances of the later crime.
Lizzie's father was rich, and he didn't have a will. Which brings us to the morning of August 4th, 1892. The Borden house on 2nd Street hummed as usual. Morning breakfast, but a couple things were different in the household. First of all, Emma, Lizzie's older sister, was out of town, and the Bordens had a house guest. This was Andrew's brother-in-law from his first marriage. Now, that morning, Abby directed their live-in maid, Bridget Sullivan, to go wash the windows after breakfast. Then, Abby went up to clean the guest room. As for Andrew, he had left the home at around 9:15 to run errands in town. And their house guest, the brother-in-law, had left to visit friends, but Lizzie was home all morning. It wasn't until around 11:45 that 32-year-old Lizzie shouted up to Bridget Sullivan to come down. She was in her room resting at the time. And when she reached Lizzie, that's when Lizzie said that her father had been murdered. And that's when Bridget saw the gruesome scene. Andrew, who'd been lying down on the divan, his face, or what was left of it, had been bludgeoned beyond recognition.
Andrew received 10 blows as he lay sleeping on the sitting room sofa. His face resembled raw meat.
Lizzie told Bridget to fetch the family doctor. Meanwhile, a trusted friend and neighbor arrived at the home. However, when the doctor and neighbor asked Lizzie where Abby was, she explained that her stepmother had received a note to visit a sick friend and wasn't home. At some point, the neighbor and doctor ventured upstairs to look for Abby, and they found her in the guest bedroom lying face down on the floor.
Abby had been felled by 19 blows in an upstairs guest room.
Police had been called and quickly dispatched to the scene, and it was determined that based on the coagulation of blood around Abby's wounds, that she'd been murdered first. Her time of death would be calculated to around 9:15 in the morning, which meant she'd never gone to visit a friend that morning. Investigators also started piecing together what happened in the Borden house that morning. According to the 3 people who had survived the morning in the Borden house.
On the morning of August 4th, 1892, 5 people woke up in the Borden household. 2 of them, Andrew and Abby, would be dead in a few hours. Of the 3 remaining people in the house, one, John Morse, who was Andrew's brother-in-law from his first marriage, was a horse trader and general kind of ne'er-do-well who was visiting from out of town. He was considered to be a very likely suspect because of his associations, and was actually followed around by an angry mob. But he had an alibi that was out of an Agatha Christie novel. He was riding in a horse car to a different part of town to visit other relatives at the time of the first murder. And although the conductor didn't remember him, he did remember the 6 priests who were also riding on the car with him at the same time.
So the brother-in-law was alibied out.
So that left 2 women in the house. One was Bridget Sullivan, who was the family's Irish domestic servant. And she was also considered a possible suspect. Under prevailing criminological theories of the day, immigrants were considered kind of prone to criminality. And she was, after all, not the daughter. She was someone who might have some crazy grudge based on the fact that her work was difficult.
But Bridget had an alibi. Around the time of Abby's murder, the maid had been seen washing the windows outside, and she'd also had a conversation with a neighbor in person.
And that pretty much eliminated her. So that left one possible suspect. And then that was Lizzie Borden. And she was someone who had no alibi. She claimed to have been at various points of the morning, upstairs, downstairs, ironing handkerchiefs, doing other things at the time of her stepmother's murder. And then, although she saw her father before his murder, when he returned about an hour and a half later, she was supposedly out in the barn eating a pear and looking for a sinker at the time that he was killed.
Lizzie goes over her changing story with police. She said the first part of the morning she'd ironed handkerchiefs, but she had to wait for the iron to get hot enough, and so during that time, she was in the kitchen reading a magazine. Lizzie also told police that she hadn't seen her stepmother since Abby had gone up to clean the guest room at around 9:15, the same time her father, Andrew, had left the house to run errands. However, the note she claimed that her stepmother had received to visit a friend was nowhere to be found, and never would be. According to the timeline, based on the stomach contents of Abby and her husband, Andrew, Abby was murdered after her husband left the house. And when he returned at 10:45 and asked where Abby was, Lizzie said that she'd received a note to visit a friend and wasn't home, prompting Andrew to go lay down on the sofa. And according to Lizzie, she then went to the barn where she stayed for 20 minutes, looking for an iron sinker to attach to her fishing line because she had an upcoming trip to the seaside. Lizzie told investigators that when she was in the barn, she didn't hear her father being butchered inside. But by 11:45, when she re-entered the home, that's when she found her father had been murdered. Investigators from the beginning were suspicious of Lizzie's story, but they didn't want to believe that she was capable of such a horrific crime.
The police's first thought was that, it was probably one of the immigrants in town, and that's what seemed most likely, that when confronted with something really brutal, it was probably somebody who was relatively recent arrival and, or possibly somebody who's crazy, and preferably an insane immigrant. I mean, that would be the best and easiest combination, and the one that would provide an answer that I think was, least disturbing to the status quo, let's say.
We talked about the prevailing attitudes about criminality in 1892, from the European model by Cesare Lombroso, the leading proponent of the Italian school of criminology. It's basically racial profiling.
Yeah, it's basically this idea that criminals are born, not made. And that not only, is there an inherent criminality in certain people, we can figure out exactly who's a criminal and what kind of crimes they're likely to commit by the way they look. So he was literally providing drawings, pictures of different features on people. And, I think to the modern eye, we'd say pretty clearly that they seem to track the sort of people who were considered less desirable in society at that time, so that those ideas were imported into America, that the criminal features seemed to track people who were more likely to be recent immigrants. So, as you say, it's pretty clear racial profiling. It's obviously complete nonsense. Mm-hmm. But it seemed to provide some reassurance for people. The idea that there is a type of person who's a criminal, rather than that anyone could be a criminal given the right circumstances.
The police searched the community, looking for a suspect outside the Borden home.
The layout of the house and the timeline of the murders meant that really there were only three options. One of the two women who was known to be in the house at the time, that's the Irish domestic servant, Bridget Sullivan, Lizzie Borden, or some crazy person who got in. And so it's sort of not surprising that they'd rather pick door number 3, to try to look for an outsider who must have had some kind of grudge against Mr. Borden and then got in.
But there were no signs of a break-in. The front door and basement were locked, which meant the only possible entry point was a side door that was usually latched.
There would have been no obvious way for someone to get in.
But even if some stranger assassin had gotten inside, the murders had taken place 90 minutes apart, and Bridget and Lizzie were home. Where would the murderer even hide during the interval of time between the murders? And it was also confusing because there were people who came forward, and some even confessed to the murders. But it wasn't long before all were ruled out as suspects. All except for Lizzie Borden, who didn't have an alibi and was in and around the house when both of the murders occurred.
On the one hand, she seemed like an obvious suspect, right? She's in the wrong place at the right time. She seems to, in fact, be the only person with the motive and the opportunity to have killed her father and her stepmother. The big barrier to suspicion for her was, one, that she's the daughter and there wasn't really evidence of some kind of terrible rift at the time, and two, the brutality of the murders. Women, particularly women like Lizzie Borden, who presented as pretty normal, who had a history of church volunteering, was in fact a Sunday school teacher, were thought to be incapable of murders that seemed so male-coded, that seemed like the butchery that you would expect from, an insane man.
A judicial inquiry was held on August 9th, 5 days after the murders. Lizzie was the prime suspect, and her testimony didn't add up.
That's where they get two critical pieces of evidence. One is Lizzie Borden's inconsistent statements about where she was at the time of the murders. And two, this sense of her animosity towards her stepmother, which is something that, they obviously want from her own lips, if possible.
Police also discovered that Lizzie had burned a blue dress not long after the murders. She claimed that she did so because it was stained with paint. Investigators also discovered that their prime suspect, Lizzie Borden, had tried to buy prussic acid at the drugstore, a lethal poison, a day before the murders, a fact that didn't help her cause. Some thought it was evidence of premeditation because she was denied the purchase by the pharmacist because it required a prescription. Investigators theorized that denial is what led to the axe. Lizzie Borden was arrested for the double homicide on August 11th, 7 days after the murders. Her trial began on June 5th, 1893, and a seat in the courtroom was the hottest ticket in town.
All of the major papers in the East sent their own reporters and columnists to cover the trial. And you have the sense that this is the sort of event that anyone who could be there wanted to be present. And much of these columnists' words are taken up with not just descriptions of what's actually happening in the courtroom at the trial with the principal people, but also who's in the audience, who's outside, what's the general mood. And so in that sense, it's it's probably the closest analog to something like the trial of O.J. Simpson, where you have a sense of people are riveted with this as spectacle, as entertainment, and also that the story seems to be larger than just the guilt or innocence of the person who's actually on trial. That there's something in the story that, people find so compelling that they rush to be there if they can, and if not, they're following it eagerly in their local news in multiple editions per day.
And it seemed like a lot of the people that were actually in the courtroom was like 80% women, which is the same with true crime today.
Yeah, one of the things that's most striking about the case, I think, to a modern observer, is how many women were obsessed with the story, and how much the sort of cultural gatekeepers lamented the fact that women seemed so bloodthirsty. So I think it may just be a case of women always being really interested in true crime. But of course, there was something particular about this one, which was that there was this woman who seemed very unlikely as a candidate for murder, who was on trial for her life, and that of course gave it a special resonance, or even a sort of frisson of excitement. Mm-hmm. And it was something that attracted everybody from society matrons to mill workers.
3 judges presided over the trial, and an all-male jury was selected. But Lizzie had a lot of support from friends in high places.
They pretty much rallied to her defense. And she was also very close to her sister, who was her stalwart supporter during the whole investigation and trial. And, arguably it was that support that served as a kind of character witness and made it seem even less likely that she could be the murderer. She's pretty ordinary. There's really nothing very dramatic in her background that would point towards either someone of sort of extraordinary energy or restless ambition, but also she was definitely not a placid person. She was someone who was supposed to be very determined, very forthright, and in that she resembled her father.
Lizzie made sure her appearance was impeccable in both dress and manner. Her facial features were described as sphinx-like throughout the trial. Her particular brand of stoicism captured the public's attention because she remained truly unknowable, an enigma throughout the trial, which caused speculation as to her true nature.
Sympathetic journalists considered her self-possession a sign of ladylike bearing, a sort of inborn dignity that showed her innocence. Others saw it as a proof of a decidedly unladylike coolness, a masculine nerve that seemed consistent with premeditated murder.
The prosecution argued that, basically, Lizzie Borden's motives were twofold. First, her hatred of her stepmother and financial greed. But the prosecution acknowledged that they couldn't definitively prove a motive beyond a resentment over the real estate deal and the fear that Lizzie was worried her father's wealth might go to Abby's side of the family and not to her and her sister. And the Commonwealth's case relied on circumstantial evidence. The murder weapon was believed to be a handleless hatchet found in the basement. An expert testified that a notch in Andrew's skull lined up perfectly with that blade, but couldn't definitively say that it was the actual murder weapon. And then there was the blue dress that witnesses testified that Lizzie was seen wearing on the morning of the murders. That 3 days after the crime, Lizzie's friend, Alice, told police she saw her burning a dress in the kitchen stove that she claimed was stained with paint. Lizzie's sister, Emma, testified that the dress had been stained with paint and that she'd been the one who told her to burn it that day. The dress was important because, according to expert testimony, the killer would have been splattered with blood because of sliced arteries. But without the dress, they couldn't examine the dress under a microscope either way. Even so, Lizzie, just minutes after her father was murdered, appeared calm with no blood on her hair, hands, or clothes. Just a single speck of blood had been found on her underskirt. But Lizzie explained this away, saying she was on her menstrual cycle. And as for some bloody cloths that were in a bucket in the cellar, they were there because she was on her period.
Other evidence linking Lizzie to the crime emerged. 3 men in a local drugstore identified her as the woman who tried to buy prussic acid the day before the murders. Poison, unlike a hatchet, was a woman's weapon, and Lizzie's inability to procure it seemed to explain why a well-bred woman might pick up a man's weapon and commit the murders in such a gruesome fashion.
However, the jury wouldn't hear about the prussic acid, as the judges ruled the testimony as inadmissible. And they threw out her testimony during that inquest, which had been riddled with contradictions.
The argument her lawyers make is that, she wanted to have her lawyer present. She wasn't allowed to have her lawyer present, and so they can't use it. Now, this is a long time before the Miranda decision, and so this is contrary to the law at the time. There's no reason why the inquest testimony shouldn't have been permitted at that time. Mm-hmm. But that's something that probably because she is a woman, the lawyers succeed in keeping that out.
However, but the Borden seamstress shared a story. On the stand, she testified that months before the double homicide, she was having a conversation with Lizzie where she harmlessly referred to Abby as Lizzie's mother, to which she said, quote, "Don't say that to me, for she is a mean, good-for-nothing thing." The seamstress replied, "Oh, Lizzie, you don't mean that." And Lizzie said, "Yes, I don't have much to do with her." I stay in my room most of the time. We don't eat with them if we can help it. A distant cousin of Lizzie's also testified that she shared a room with Lizzie on her return trip from Europe in 1890, and that on their way back, Lizzie repeatedly said that she did not want to return to her unhappy home. Lizzie's defense was led by former Massachusetts Governor George Robinson. Her team hammered home that the prosecution's case was all circumstantial, that there was no direct physical evidence connecting Lizzie to the murders. They didn't have a murder weapon or blood-stained clothing that could absolutely link her to these horrific crimes. And Lizzie was free of blood when she was found by neighbors right after the murders. The defense also produced neighbors who reported strange sounds the night before the murders and testified that they'd seen a strange man near the Borden property that morning, suggesting that an outside intruder absolutely could have committed the murders. And the defense leaned into the Victorian-era belief that Lizzie Borden's social status made her incapable of committing a vicious double murder, and that she had no motive to kill her father, who she loved and adored. And it's interesting because the prosecution's closing arguments focused on Lizzie's hatred of her stepmother as motivation for the murders, suggesting that she murdered Abby in a fit of rage, and that was then forced to kill her father to eliminate the only witness who would have known it was her. But the Commonwealth chose not to explore a very diabolical and cunning reason potentially behind the order of the murders. Because her father didn't have a will, the way in which the couple died would be important. Legally, if Andrew had been murdered first, his estate would have passed to his next of kin, his wife, Abby. But because she was murdered 90 minutes before her husband, that meant she was not legally his next of kin at the time of his death. However, his daughters, Lizzie and Emma, were. And because of the order in which they were murdered, that meant Abby's family would not be entitled to anything from his estate.
Essentially, Lizzie Borden's best defense was her own self-image. Her own behavior in the courtroom, her own careful manner of dressing and presenting herself as the epitome of a certain kind of upper middle class femininity. She's someone who, although very average looking, very ordinary looking, as the many, many reporters constantly described her, she was someone who presented herself very carefully. And so much so that one noted that when particularly gruesome testimony was presented or exhibits that were upsetting, she would hide her face under her fan. But that same reporter noted that when it was a presentation by her side, whether it was an expert who was more favorable to her, and he was talking about something that was fairly gruesome, that she'd watch with rapt attention. And you might think from that his conclusion would be that, she's a bit of a phony. In fact, she's sort of performing. But instead, what he says is, women are just like that, essentially. There is a way in which there is a sort of performance to a certain kind of femininity, a socially acceptable femininity. And it was like, oh, she's just like my wife. She's just like my sister. She's just like my daughter. And I think that is the real struggle for the jurors. Then they're looking at someone who could have been their own wife or their own daughter. And they just can't bring themselves to imagine that someone who looks like that, who's sitting in the courtroom day after day, wearing a hat, wearing a veil, curling her hair between sessions, could take an axe or a hatchet and kill her father and stepmother in such a horrifying way.
After 2.5 weeks of testimony, Lizzie's fate was put into the hands of the jury, who found Lizzie Borden not guilty.
They were unanimous immediately and just kind of sat there for about 45 minutes to just show some respect for the lawyers involved in the case.
Wow, so it wasn't like 12 angry men. There was none of that. They all were just like, we can't
No, they
believe.
were in fact 12 very jolly men who, after delivering their verdict, went out and had a drink at the bar because they'd been sequestered and had enforced temperance while they were serving as jurors. And in fact, they had a picture taken of themselves, which they then presented to Lizzie Borden.
Kind of enamored with Lizzie Borden, or
What I take from the speed of the verdict, this isn't a story about reasonable doubt. This is a story about a certainty, a cultural certainty that someone like Lizzie Borden could not have done such a thing.
and so then you wonder, and it makes me wonder, was she the puppet master the entire time? Did she think that, well, hey, somebody broke into our house and I got away with that if she did it, and I can do it again because they're not going to believe that I'm capable of doing this. I guess that's like, for me, I really want to know her, and I think other people do too. Like, she seemed so unassuming, and yet there was a strategy involved in the things that she did.
You hit on such an interesting point, and it's something that I was really interested in. Like, what did the lawyers actually believe? Were her defense lawyers essentially like the jury? Did they just believe she couldn't have done it, and so they were, or were they just trying to present a story that they thought would be appealing to the jury and didn't particularly think of her any differently than they would have of any other defendant?
Even though Lizzie was acquitted, she would remain the primary suspect in the eyes of public opinion. And more than 130 years later, the murders of Andrew and Abby are still unsolved. But Lizzie and Emma inherited their father's estate of around $10 million.
One of the most interesting parts of the story is that Lizzie Borden chooses to stay in Fall River when she could have gone anywhere and been, if not an anonymous, at least not quite so infamous. But she chose, along with her sister, to move out of the small family house and into effectively a McMansion, in the elite area of Fall River in the Hill District, where she had always wanted to live. And despite suffering a certain amount of ostracism over her life, she stuck it out there, and I think that speaks to her nerve, her resolve, and also maybe her limitations, this sort of sense that really that was the extent of her ambition was this house on a hill, but that she was quite happy to have it, despite the opinions of her neighbors who thought that, she should spend her life kind of trying to live down the murders instead of living it up.
I mean, I think that tracks if you think she did it. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like, yeah, not only did I did it, but I got the money and I'm living the high life now, which is what her and her sister want. Did they just remain, live there for the rest of their lives together and they never got married or anything? The two sisters?
So she and her sister had a mysterious falling out in 1905. Her sister moved out and they never spoke to each other again.
Lizzie Borden died at her home on the hill on June 1st, 1927. As per her wishes, she would be buried at her father's feet at the Borden family plot. As for her sister, Emma, she died 10 days after Lizzie and would be buried right next to her.
What do you think now, after all your research? Like, do you think that she did it?
Oh, well, that's something which I'm sorry, spoiler alert, or rather non-spoiler alert, that, I don't have an answer for. I think that, my job was to lay out all the facts so that people could arrive at their own decision, sort of like a jury. What strikes me is that we don't today have the same barrier to belief and guilt that I think that they did then. In other words, we don't imagine that a woman couldn't do something terrible like that. That we don't have the same assumption that was prevalent in society at the time of the inherent virtue of that particular class of woman, that someone who was a Sunday school teacher and a volunteer in other church matters couldn't possibly, do something terrible. We know that people, unfortunately, people people do bad things all the time.
But will we ever know the truth?
It's funny because like Jack the Ripper, I think I saw a headline recently where they're like, yep, the case is solved. We know it's this person. But with this case, I don't think you never came across any answers as to like, yeah, they've been able to dig up something and now they've tested the DNA and we know that it was Lizzie Borden. Like, is there ever going to be anything like this in this particular case?
Yeah, I think that the answer is no, that we're never going to know. It's always going to be an unsolved mystery because she was tried and she was acquitted. And there's something that's sort of inherently open-ended about that. And as you say, there's no way they're going to find anything that could definitively prove anything one way or the other. But, it's a case where you just have to live with the mystery.
I highly recommend Cara's book, The Trial of Lizzie Borden. You will love it. And you can find out more at Cara's website.
CaraWRobertson.com.
Okay, cool.
And I do answer questions if anyone has any follow-up.
Oh, great. Okay, well, we'll have all your information in our show notes. And thank you so much for taking the time to chat today.
Thank you, Carolyn.
Stick around for our Criminal Mischief bonus content. Here, my co-host, Brandon Morgan, and I will continue the Lizzie Borden conversation, like super interesting bits that didn't make it into the show. And I don't know if you know this, but we have a Criminal Mischief YouTube channel. You can find us at evocreative.com. And as always, thanks for listening. From Pie in the Sky Media, Criminal Mischief is an EVO production, recorded live in the beautiful Pacific Northwest. We're produced by Brandon Morgan and myself. Music by Soundstripe. For EVO Creative, I'm Carolyn Ossorio, your writer and host.